Hello, this is the story of how I built this. This is the pet house. It's a tiny house. Why did I build it? How did I build it? How much did it cost? And why did it take me almost a year to complete? Why is it called Pet House? Why is it absolutely unique? All this and more is what I'm going to show you in this video. Hope you enjoy. I've been renting a single family house for about 4 years now. I've been living here with 6 friends. The house itself isn't huge, but the garden is. About 2,000 square meters to be precise. We've always had the feeling that there is potential for our small community to grow a bit bigger. So 3 years ago, I decided to use my upcoming master thesis in architecture to do something meaningful and build a tiny house in the garden for someone to live in. Who exactly wasn't clear, but I was sure we'd find someone who would like to move in once it would be finished. Now, here's the crux of the project. I rent this house and the contract only goes for 3 years. So whatever I build has to be transportable so that I can take it with me if I were to move out. What makes that difficult though is that the access road to the property is so steep and so narrow that getting a full tiny house on a trailer up here is absolutely impossible. So the only solution is to make the house easily deconstructible so that I can deconstruct it, take it down the hill, set it back up again at a new location without having to destroy anything. Now, it also needs to be very light for me to be able to do that. And one inherent problem of very light buildings is that they don't have much thermal mass. That means you can insulate them all you want. If there's nothing inside to actually retain that heat, you will have to do a lot of cooling in the summer and heating in the winter, at least with the climate as it is here, because we have quite hot summers and quite cold winters. So I came up with a solution, which I call temporary thermal mass. What does that look like? Like this. This is a 1 liter water bottle, and I'm using 400 of these. It's made from PET, hence the name Pet House. Also because it's a tiny house. These bottles are filled with water when the house is stationary, and I just empty them out whenever I have to move the house. Now, why water? A, because it's free. B, it's readily available anywhere where you would want to build a house. C, because you can easily dispose of it. And D, which is the main reason, is because water is the material with the best heat storage capabilities of any common material, only surpassed by pure hydrogen, which would be a really bad idea because that would blow up the house. Water can store 4.5 times as much thermal energy per mass as concrete. This is a 1 liter water bottle, alas 1 kilogram, which would be about 2 of these very heavy bricks. So here's a quick sketch of the concept. First you have the foundations. On these foundations sits a frame for the floor modules. Then come the wall and roof modules. Windows are already built into the wall modules, which can be interchanged to adapt the house to a new location. And everything should pack up nicely. As you can see in these plans, the design features a kitchen and a bathroom, which I decided not to build right now because there's 2 bathrooms and the kitchen in the main house, and I'd much rather have the added space as a living area. Both bathroom and kitchen could be retrofitted at a later stage if needed though. I built the modules inside a big storage building of one of the main sponsors of the project, Fürslauer. They are Austria's biggest mineral water company and were kind enough to let me use this space, which was absolutely perfect, albeit very cold, because it was winter and the space had no heating, because empty water bottles apparently don't need to be warm. I started by building the frame from 4 pieces of solid spruce. These cuts that you see here were quite tricky to make because I only had relatively small and cheap woodworking tools available. So here you see me going at it with a handsaw and then with my reciprocating saw. It was quite tedious, it took quite a bit of work, but in the end I got it done. In general, one of the few regrets that I have with this project is not having bought better tools sooner, it would have saved me lots of headaches and would have made things so much quicker and so much more precise. As you can see here, the frame is quite heavy. I mean, I can lift one piece of it by myself. But yeah, it's definitely one of the more unwieldy parts of the house. Here you see me setting it up for the first time. It's on 4 temporary foundations, so to speak. And this is just seeing if everything actually fits together. And that was the first quite satisfying moment. In most of the shots you will see me wearing a high-vis vest. That's because of all the forklift drivers there. The space that they gave me was actually really perfect. It was over 100 square meters, I think. Here you see me cutting down the first pieces for the first floor modules. I think I spent probably around 2 weeks just cutting wood, cutting boards. The sheets are made of hardboard, which you might know from the backside, the back panels of your IKEA furniture. They are an amazing material, which is basically just compressed wood fibers with no glue added. So it's a very sustainable and organic material. It's relatively heavy, about twice as heavy as wood, but since I'm using it in only 3mm sheets for the most part, it enables the modules to be very light. Not only does the hardboard act as a bracing for the individual modules, but it's also what kind of guides me in the building process. I always took special care to cut the sheets with at least 0.5 millimeter accuracy and then derive everything else from there. So during the building process, I developed a kind of mantra, which was the sheets speak the truth, because these sheets would always be much more accurate and square and true than the pieces of solid wood. Here you just saw me glue a moisture barrier. It's not really a barrier, it's just something that limits the amount of moisture that goes through the walls. I did that in order to prevent mold from building up inside the modules. And as insulation, I used recycled cocoa bags made from entirely organic material, which was also very fun and very easy to install. Here I'm installing these kind of slats that are actually on the underside of the floor modules to keep the insulation in place so that it doesn't fall out. In total, the structure of the house consists of 28 of these modules, which make up the floor, the walls, the roof, and the loft space. The floor modules were one of the least complex of the modules, and cutting all the parts and assembling one of those took me about 2 days. There are 4 of them in total, so with the frame and everything, I think I managed to build the base of the house in a bit over a week. Here you see me test fitting the first 2 floor modules, and you see that the frame is still open, and I would have these kind of small support pieces of wood as a temporary fixture. Here I'm calling help from one of the guys who works at the factory. And here you see Lisa, my girlfriend, helping me out with putting the third floor module in. I worked alone on, say, 9 out of 10 days, and it was quite lonely. So every time a friend came over to help me, it was really nice for a change. And here you see me trying it alone. It does work, but yeah, it's a bit more tedious. Then I'm test fitting the last piece of the frame. And here you see Lisa installing the ceiling strips that go between the modules so that no humidity gets in between them, either from the inside or the outside, so that there is, again, no mold. Here you see me taking off the lids of the modules again to attach them to each other. At first I used these 10mm steel bolts for this, but then later for the other modules resorted to normal wood screws because it was just that much faster. Then I assembled the frame and I adjusted the whole thing with these straps to A, pull it together, and B, to make it square. Here you see me marking and drilling the holes for the bolts that connect the frame pieces to each other. I spent a total of 4 months in this space. In the beginning, in the first month, I did 5-day work weeks, and then I noticed that I wasn't making progress fast enough, so I changed to 7-day work weeks, and I did that for, I think, 3 months straight, which was quite exhausting, especially since I had to take the train for an hour per direction to get there. And here I'm testing out the stability of the floor, and it held, and that made me happy. Next step was building the wall modules. Here I'm building a corner module. Those were actually the most complex modules of all of them. I think one of those consists of something around 50 individual pieces that all had to be cut. So one of those, probably including cutting all the pieces, took me around 3 days to complete, with 4 of them being there in total. Most of the time having someone to help me actually more than doubled the work efficiency, because some of the tasks, like cutting a straight line and adjusting the fence for cutting, walking back and forth alone, was just that much more inefficient. Also, I noticed that just having someone there and kind of them waiting for me to tell them what to do, and me being very anxious not to waste the precious work time that they are willing to lend me, made me operate much more efficient. Here Lisa's installing the ceilings that go between the frame and the wall modules. That also was quite a satisfying task, as you can see. This is a forklift that I borrowed from the company, and I used it to set up a crane. The crane was basically just climbing static rope, running through the trusses with a winch mounted on the wall. And I thought I would be using this a lot to kind of lift stuff up and down to help me during construction. You can see us here testing it and lifting up the modules. One module weighs around 40 kilos, so it's actually liftable by 2 people. It turned out to be completely unnecessary, and we never really used it, or never really had to use it. In the end, we just did everything by hand. Here I'm screwing down the modules to the frame, again this time just with wood screws, with quite big ones. And in general I designed the house in such a way that assembling it and disassembling it would require a maximum of 2 people. Here we are finishing the first wall and then celebrating the end of a long work day. A part of the wood that I used for building the house is actually upcycled, which means it was already part of a house and they had to renovate the roof, and I took all the old beams from that demolition site and I refurbished them to have a second life in a second house. Here I'm building the modules that make up the slab for the raised loft area, where there would be the sleeping space in the end, and I just slot them in. That was a very satisfying thing to do. Those are very light, and as you can see on the underside, they have these translucent, transparent panels. That's because they house the water bottles, and I wanted the water bottles to be visible in the house when it's finished, and also install some backlighting there, and that's why it's transparent. Here you see me happily testing out the loft area and being very happy that it holds. This is my handwritten cut list, and these are all the parts for the roof modules. That was, I think, a 2-week marathon of just cutting parts. And here you see the also very satisfying task of cleaning up after that, because that made a huge mess. Here a friend of mine, also called Lisa, is helping me install the gable modules, and you can see that all the window modules are already built with the openings. After 4 months, Verslauer needed their space back, and at that point I had finished all the structural modules of the house. So with the help of 3 friends, Lukas, Kati and Lisa, I disassembled the house. This took half a day, and packed everything up in order to transport it to my garden, where I would reassemble it and then finish building the rest of the house there. I think this was probably one of the most fun, if stressful, days of the whole build. As you can see here, the house was not completely finished before we took it down and transported and reassembled it. I think in the future, with the completely finished house, it would probably take me about a week to deconstruct it, move it, and then put it back up again. We of course not only had to transport all the modules of the house, but also all the materials for the unfinished parts of the house, all the tools, all the construction site equipment, and that was only possible with the help of many friends. Transporting everything took roughly 15 people, 100 working hours, 2 days, and that was the part where I felt the most grateful for having such amazing friends. Not only my housemates, but also other people, family. With a normal car, going up to our property means going into first gear, full throttle and hoping for the best. But here, Manfred was so kind to lend me his pickup truck, which actually could just crawl up the hill, which was crucial for getting the big modules up unharmed. The next step after transporting the house was building the foundation. The foundation consists of 6 holes, which you see me dig here, and the soil was so compact, mostly thick clay and rocks, that it took me about 2.5 to 3 hours per hole. Each hole is about 1 meter deep. That's the depth where water won't freeze anymore. And the foundation pillars themselves are untreated black locust tree logs. That is the most rot-resistant, locally available wood that we have here. They should last untreated in the ground for at least 40 years, according to experiences from other people. I got the idea to use those as a foundation from Manfred, the guy with the pickup truck, because he owns a vineyard, and traditionally the sticks that hold up the grapes are made from the same wood. The logs rest on the rocks that I dug out and cleaned, and the rocks also act as a drainage. Normally, if you build a house, you want it to last generations, and you would never use wood for the foundations. But since I'm planning on moving the house in a few years anyways, wood is actually perfect because I can just leave it in the ground. It will rot and will have basically no ecological footprint. Everything about this build is very experimental though, so if you want to try and build something similar yourself, I take absolutely no responsibility if any of it will work or not. After positioning the foundations, the next thing was throwing a bunch of rocks in there. As I said, the soil was mostly rocks, so I just cleaned them and threw them back in. That acts as a drainage so that the logs don't get wet underground. And also, you see they remain in position, but I can still move them around, which is very handy when the next step is actually putting the floor frame of the house on top of them. So at this stage, everything can still be adjusted. And then once I finished assembling the house, I just poured a little bit of concrete around the logs, which kind of just positioned them in place. In that case, the concrete was not load-bearing at all. The chainsaw here is used to cut them all to the same level. I'm using a laser level for that. This was my first time ever using a chainsaw. It was very exciting. And after I was done with the foundation, I called up a lot of friends again to help me assemble the house. At this time of the year, it started getting a bit warmer, which was a welcome change after basically living in a warehouse with 0 degrees for 4 months straight. This was the day before all of my friends came to help me assemble the house, and the last step that I did to prepare for that was just to install the 2 long parts of the floor frame to the foundations so that everything would be ready the next day. The metal feet that I'm using here to connect the foundation to the frame are height adjustable, which is crucial to adjust for any uneven settling of the individual foundations to keep everything level later. The weather for the upcoming days looked very dry and stable, which was important because rain during the assembly process would have been really bad for the modules. The assembly of all the modules took us exactly 2 days, again with the help of, I think, in total 10 people. And as I said, in theory, all of these steps would be possible with just 2 people, but since it was my first time reassembling the house and I wasn't sure if the weather would really hold up and if everything would actually work, I better played it safe and had a lot of help again. The only part that probably would not work with only 2 people or would be really difficult is installing the last roof module, and you will see that later. Having that many people allowed us to move very fast. You had 2 or 3 people putting up a module, then you had 2 or 3 people who fixed it to the module before that, then you had another 2 or 3 people getting the next module ready. It was very cool. Also, after having worked by myself alone for 4 months straight, it was a very nice and welcome change to be surrounded by so many friends and so many lovely people. One thing that made the assembly also a lot easier is, of course, taking out the windows. The windows are a bit special because nowadays, at least where I live, it's standard to use triple glazed windows, and here I only used double glazed windows, which is much less energy efficient, but just for the purpose of weight, and since it's such a small space anyways, I opted for double glazed windows. After putting up the wall and gable modules, it was time for the loft modules. And here I did something which I think is really, really cool. I made them movable. I put up these extra temporary railings, so that way you could just move those modules and have them wherever you would need them as a kind of mobile platform to install the roof modules. I think that might be one of the simplest, but to me personally one of the coolest ideas while building this house, because it made the process so much easier. And here you can see, even though those modules are quite big and quite heavy, it's actually no problem to do everything with 2 people, except for, as I said, the last module, because with the last module you can't put it up from the inside, but you have to lift it onto the roof from the outside, and you will see that in just a bit. Another thing that was really cool at this stage was just getting a feel for the space for the first time in its designated environment, because up until then the house didn't have a view. It was inside a storage building, and now having an actual view of the windows felt really amazing. Getting the roof modules in place was a bit trickier than with the wall modules, but it also worked out really smoothly, and I think that was just a half day of us doing the roof. I think this part of the assembly is the most satisfying to watch, because the house actually comes together. And assembling all the modules took us 1.5 days. At this stage, the house has its full structural integrity. It's insulated and airtight as soon as I put the windows in, but it's still lacking a few crucial things. First off, a proper outer layer that's weather resistant, meaning a roof and a facade. While the hardboard surfaces of the modules can get wet, they wouldn't last very long if exposed to the elements year round, so they only act as a second kind of backup layer underneath the outer shell. The first thing I addressed was the roof, and I was in a bit of a hurry with this one because I wanted to get it done before the first proper rain. These joists that support the actual roofing panels will remain on the roof modules when I have to transport the house again. The panels themselves are made from corrugated bitumen paper because it's by far the cheapest and lightest option, and it's really easy to install. You will see me climb around the outside of the house a lot without any personal safety gear. Something I actually profited from a lot, but especially during this part of the build, was my experience in parkour and rock climbing, which have been 2 very defining sports in my life. While I could have done a lot of these things with more safety measures in place, I was 100% confident in my ability not to fall off the house, which made it possible to do things a lot quicker. I don't recommend this approach though, if you don't know what you're doing. The next thing you will see me do is build a deck that runs around half of the house where it protrudes over the slope. It uses the same construction principle as the rest of the house, which is I-beams made from hardboard and timber. These beams are mounted on the underside of the house and work as cantilevers. The planks are sourced entirely from reused timber, and this deck is also necessary as a construction platform for building the facade. I just talked about how my experience in parkour and rock climbing helped me with the physical part of building the house, but I think I also profited from another aspect of doing these sports, and by that I mean the mental side. Parkour and climbing have taught me a lot about commitment and perseverance, and I feel that really translated to this project. The whole project took 3 years, and in the beginning I had no idea if any of it would work or how long it would take me or how I would finance it. But just trying, and as soon as it felt feasible, committing and then following through felt a bit like doing a difficult jump or climbing an intimidating route. I think it's funny to watch back this footage and see me topless in one moment and in full-on winter gear in the next, but that's typical for the weather in April around here. In any case, I enjoyed being able to work outdoors so much. It was such a nice change from the cold and lonely industrial atmosphere in which I built the modules. I think me trimming down these boards all to the same length is the most satisfying footage of the whole build. After trimming down the boards and taking a test stroll over the newly built deck, I spent a few hours sanding it down. After that and oiling the boards, I think the end result looks absolutely beautiful, especially the combination of all the different wood colors. As expected by now, which is 8 months later, everything took on a more muted uniform greyish tone. After that, I covered the barge boards with bitumen as well. Originally, I had planned on putting on ornamental boards over that again, but then decided that keeping it like that felt more honest, more minimalistic and more functional, which in turn felt more in line with the overall concept of the house. Next up, I installed the exterior window sills. The windows themselves are made from local larch, and like the deck and later on the interior surfaces, are just finished with oil. No stains and no lacquer means no toxins and no microplastic, and it allows the wood to breathe. Also, larch is a very weather-resistant type of wood. Here I'm building the exterior reveal for the windows. For that I'm using the same material as the rest of the facade, which is spruce boards that are thermally modified, meaning heated, which makes them more weather-resistant, also known as thermo-wood. This is a material that's not as sustainable as I would have liked, because the process takes a lot of energy. Ideally, I would have built the facade from larch as well, but ever since Russia invaded Ukraine, getting larch in big quantities isn't really affordable anymore, because Russia was the main producer of larch for the European market. Also, morally, I wouldn't want to support the economy of a murderous dictatorship anyways, so thermowood it is. I grouped the facade boards into modules as well, which means that when I transport the house, I don't have to take down hundreds of individual boards, but around 25 large panels. Building the facade took about 2 weeks in total, mostly because of that modularity and the complicated connections to the doors and windows. Seeing the house getting absolutely drenched in a rainstorm for the first time, but with no water going anywhere where it shouldn't go, was very satisfying and a huge relief. Here we are installing the last big facade module, and these are the last finishing touches to the exterior of the house. After that, I mounted the drain before I started working on the interior of the house to finish it all up. For the interior wall cladding, as with the facade, I grouped the boards into panels, which are roughly equivalent to the size of the wall modules themselves. Also, just like with the facade, the need to have everything be able to come apart again easily and in large panels made this a lot trickier and much more labor intensive than with the normal stationary building. The space between the boarding and the hardboard of the wall modules is 4 centimeters wide, and where the modules are attached to each other. I either fill that space with some more insulation, or I use it to run the electricity through. Grouping the boards into panels like this also gives me these very ugly vertical seams, which I have to cover up later. One mistake that I made was not storing these boards 100% dry, before installing them, so some of them got a bit wet and swole up, which caused some gaps later when they dried and shrank down again. Next up, I filled the 400 empty PET bottles with water and placed them in the loft modules. Filling up all the bottles took about 2 hours by submerging them in the bathtub, and my hands hurt a bit after having to screw on 400 caps. Screwing on the bottle caps was also definitely the thing that took the most time about the whole process. Here I'm testing the backlighting for the first time, and I think it looks really cool. After that, I built the floor. Underneath the floor is a thin layer of cork to prevent it from making noises. I grouped the floor into 3 large panels by gluing the boards together, again having to fight with the gaps that I caused by improper storage. And by fight, I mean fill them with wood filler, which actually turned out to give the floor a really cool finished look in the end. I then built a ladder to access the sleeping loft. Originally I wanted to make it movable, but then decided to just screw it in place because it was easier, and there's only one point anyways where the ceiling is tall enough to climb up. Then I installed a sideboard on the backside of the room, which sits above the air condition unit. The air condition also works as a heater in winter and is 2.7 times more efficient than a standard electrical radiator. It's a model that comes without an outdoor unit, which in theory is great for this project. In practice though, it broke down after 4 months of use, so I can't recommend either the model nor the manufacturer for that matter. The last thing to do was to cover the vertical gaps between the interior wall cladding modules. These 1 centimeter thick strips of reused timber are the only aspect of the house that's purely ornamental, but it would have looked really ugly without them, and I like how they highlight the modular construction of the house by really showing where each module is. And that's it. Here's the finished space. I think it's turned out to be a gorgeous space. I love how light it is inside. I love the big windows. I love the view. I love how large the space feels, which is mostly due to the big windows and the ceiling being up to 2.80 meters tall. I love how cozy the loft is. It feels a bit like sleeping in the mountain shelter. And I love seeing all those little details, even the imperfections, knowing exactly how it all came together. Basically having like an X-ray view for the building through having built everything myself. While building the house, the question of who would actually live there was still open until Lisa, my girlfriend, said that she'd be interested in moving in. She had been renting an apartment in the city centre, which was A, quite expensive, and B, unbearably hot in the summer. We had been together for 2.5 years at that point, and the idea of her moving in felt so good, I was quick to say yes. And her living in the house would also mean that I would be using it too, instead of just renting it out to someone else. We've been now using it for 5 months, and it's turned out to be a really nice space to live in as well. It's really quiet in here, and the thermal performance is also really good. For example, the temperature only drops by like 4 degrees when we turn off the heating, from 20 to 16 degrees Celsius over the course of 12 hours with 0 degrees outside. How do you like living in the pet house?
I love living in a pet house. It's very quiet and very close to nature. And the fact that I open my eyes and can see the entire valley outside when I wake up is really nice. I can spend a lot of time looking for animal faces in the wooden paneling of the walls. It's very entertaining. I like that it's a space that did not exist before. The space was built in a warehouse, and it was the same space there as it is now, but it's also a vastly different space now because it's lived in, and I think I like that. I use it for sleeping and for spending time reading a book or doing craft projects, and I work from home half of the week. It's a really good space to live in, and I think if I knew about someone else living here, I'd be jealous, but I'm in the extremely lucky position to be the person who's living inside it, so I don't have to be jealous about that.
So off to the hard facts that everybody wants to know. How much did it cost me to build this? Well, it's hard to say because, first of all, I used upcycled materials, so I didn't pay for any of that. But I bought new tools for the project, I also got grants. I didn't pay for some of the materials, but instead I did services in return for some of the sponsors, or they gave me special prices. Also, I didn't pay any of my friends who helped me, and all of my work was also unpaid. What I can say is that if I had to build the house again without any grants, sponsorships or special agreements, it would be roughly 23,000 euros in materials, 4,000 euros for renting a space where I could build the modules, and around 20 to 30,000 euros if I were to pay myself an hourly rate of 25 euros. So if I were a business and I would want to sell a house just like this one, it would be priced at a minimum of 60,000 euros. Overall, the project took about 2,500 hours over the course of 3 years, from idea to me finishing my thesis about it, with a bit over 1,000 hours of that for actually building the house. If you want more details, including detailed finances, plans, and an assembly instruction, there's a link to the thesis in the description. The thesis is in German though, so you might have to translate it, but it's mostly plans, photos and graphics anyways. I really hope you enjoyed this video about the project that defined basically the last 3 years of my life. If you stuck around until now, all I have to say is I'm somewhat surprised, and thank you for watching.